next part of this day, we sort of called it a question and answer session. And you may want to ask questions about anything about teacher research. You may want to comment on anything you've heard. So let's have a free-flowing discussion, hopefully. So this is a chance for you, the participants, to express yourself about anything that you've seen or heard today. Any of the comments from Dick, John, Anne or Donald, but also from the posters, any issues that come into your mind, or the initial questions they had. That might be a good chance to raise those issues. And then at 3 o'clock we'll have a few more posters here in the same style. So until 3 o'clock we'll have a general discussion. Would anyone like to kick it off? And it's more like, I don't really want sharing it, I think just talk to one another across the room.
Well, I'd like to take a little bit of issue with Dick's comments about publication. I don't think Dick will be surprised. I might just stand here so I don't get embarrassed. For me, publication is not about academic forms of publication in the sort of traditional sense of publication. I think what I take from publication is the idea of making public. And I think there are a great deal of number of ways of making public. And these may range, these could even range from making things public in the classroom as a way of beginning the research, to the sort of extreme continuum end of doing a PhD through teacher or action research, or publishing or letting other people know about your research through newsletters or presentations, or possibly writing articles for journal publication as well. So I don't really share the idea that publication is not important and useful in this form of research. In fact, I'm quite an advocate of teacher publication because I think that we need more teacher publication. I think one of the things I see, or themes I see in the literature is, what is this thing called action research or teacher research, and we don't know anything about it because teachers don't publish. So I think it's quite important for us to think about how we can demythologize or demystify or deconstruct some of those themes that seem to come up about teacher research and actually contribute in some way from the very interesting research of the sort we've been hearing about this morning, so that we begin to get teacher research into the equation of research. So that's my little homily about publication, and you're very welcome to react, disagree, or just change the subject. Thank you.
Would it help if I say I actually agree with you?
Oh, no.
I think we're talking at different ends of it, that's all.
Yeah. Yeah. Say more.
I just don't like the pressure put on people, if it happens that way, to actually find a form of words for understandings that they feel they can live with, but can't see how on earth they can communicate them in some direct fashion without trivializing. That's all. It's really, and I would like to encourage people from the beginning not to think that it's not worth doing lesson publishing. I remember some private language school in this country that was trying to encourage classroom research, and had this lovely system which meant that if you undertook classroom research, you got a couple of hours off your timetable, because it was understood you could possibly do it within your normal timetable, which was a bit sad. And then, if it was good enough, you got published. And that seemed to be, the person who was doing it, had no idea that there could be any possible objection to that. But it seemed to be sending all the wrong messages. I didn't like the idea that the school itself was saying we can't expect people to do research unless we give them time off. It seemed totally unnecessary. And I think the only way of getting reward for it is by publishing it in the school newsletter. It seemed to be, listed all your points about thousands of other ways in which that stuff could get out and around and help other people. Yeah, so I don't have a problem with what you're saying, but I have a different end of it that I'm mostly interested in.
If I can just add very briefly to that. In the research projects from Australia, which you've been hearing about this morning, some of my Australian colleagues, one of the ideas about teachers coming into that program is that they do publish. That publication is actually a commitment to the program. So I'd be quite interested to hear from the teachers about whether they thought that was a real imposition, something which would deter them in a way, or whether it was something that became satisfying.
The second.
Can I perhaps say that one of the things that stops me from publishing, I've done a very small bit of it, is that I'm obliged to review other people's work. And I find that so difficult to do enough reading, get deeply enough into a particular area so that I can provide a background context for whatever it is I think I've got to say about classroom research. It's that literature review that's the real block for me.
Well, I don't see a literature review as necessarily something you have to do in a
That was my point about genre.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a borrowed genre. And I think you're speaking very articulately. In fact, that's a genre that doesn't work with your day job, And so why should you have to change your day job in order to represent what you know and what you're finding out? And we were having a conversation about places to make public work. Let's maybe not use the publication word, but make public. And one of the issues is if you go to existing places, you have to play by their rules. And I would just sort of put out that I think it's important to also think about creating other venues to make work public. And we live in a time now where, we tweet and we post and we do all of these things. And so the fact that these existing venues seem to, my word would be colonize the way we think, is maybe something that we might want to push back on a bit, for exactly the reasons you said. I mean, I think it would be a crime if something that you think is worth sharing with others is held up because you don't have the time to do something which is actually, nowhere is it written that that's part of what ought to happen. It's a social expectation, it's not more than that.
Some may remember a lovely paper by Mr. Ramani and 7 other people from Bangalore who were worried about how to survive their huge classes in 121. And they got together as the Bangalore English language group and decided that what they really needed to do was go into each other's classrooms and see what it looked like in somebody else's room. They did that, came back together again, and amazingly and wonderfully, they said, you don't want to see it as a problem.
Yeah.
We've got 120 people, right, so let's find a way of working with 120 people. Now, there must be a way of doing it that is not, that we should not have to see as a problem. We've got to find a way of giving 120 people a different sort of productive experience and not expect them to do exactly the same thing or learn. The best bit about that paper, however, and it got published in English Language Teaching Journal to their credit, at the end of the paper they write something like, now that we have done all our own thinking on the matter, we are interested to see what other people have written about it. And that was wonderful. I mean that it got published and that it was with that statement that we've done our thinking, now we know what to look for in literature, it makes it worthwhile doing literature review, but they didn't need it for that publication.
Could I take us in a different direction? I mean, a little bit, but it's related. One of the questions that Ann and I were sort of talking about at lunch, and I'd be interested if the poster presenters might want to respond to this, is what if someone were to say to you, this is all very well and good, but how's this any different than good teaching, what you've done?
This morning, it was the first thing we talked about in our little group. This is good teaching. It's just we've labelled it as action research was my reaction, and it is good teaching. And if you do have a conscience and you do want to help your students out, and you see that something you have taught didn't work out, a responsible teacher does walk away and say, well, what can I do to do that differently? And why did it work last week and it didn't work this week? And it may be that the students were different. And I think if you are a teacher with a conscience, you do that already. But what we did, for example, in Australia, when we did our action research, was we wrote about it. So this is what I was telling colleagues at work. We do what we're doing on a regular basis, but no, there is a few more surveys involved because we're receiving more feedback from the students. Or we will write a report at the end, but really this should be what good teaching is all about, if good can be classified in a responsible and conscious way.
So let me follow up then. If we want to call this, I don't know if everyone would agree, this work responsible teaching, what is gained by calling it research?
Probably acting upon it. We're actually doing something about it. We could all sit back and say, I'm responsible.
Yeah.
But then, where is the action to show the responsibility is actually taking place? Maybe.
Also understanding as well. I would gain understanding from doing research.
But you don't, let me play devil's advocate, you don't gain understanding from being a responsible teacher?
Oh, I do, but I suppose this is, maybe it's just more explicit and, yeah, I would, yeah.
Claire, you guys.
Yeah, I was going to say that I agree, you know, that we get this understanding or the insight or whatever. One of the questions I wrote down this morning is, how can you share that? So, in getting away from using the word publish, I always have the question in my mind, like, well, okay, I'm going to do this, and I want to find out whether this and this, but maybe somebody's already done that and can already give me ideas or tips of how to change and share their understanding or whatever. And I think, for me, the word would not be published, but how do we share so that we don't all just do the same thing over and over again and think that we've invented something amazing? Why don't we put it all together? Or how can we put it all together if we're not going to publish the traditional academic sense?
We can start our own journal.
Yeah.
We start our own research journal. Yeah. Richard Smith.
We have a newsletter, and we are privileging teacher research in the newsletter. So that's one thing. And Deb, might be a good chance to talk about the idea.
But
Yeah.
no, I just wanted to respond to this kind of conversation really, because I haven't done anything recently, but when I did, when I was teaching in the classroom, I don't know, for me anyway, by thinking this is research as opposed to professional development, and then kind of formalising how I go about dealing with what's happening, and even writing it down or presenting it or sharing it in some way, it kind of fixes it or makes it more concrete or more real. And I think it's much easier to move forward from something like that, almost like putting foundations in a building or whatever, than it is to just kind of let it dissipate and then you move on to something else. Because when you're a busy teacher, things are changing so fast, and you're always presented with other things that you're focusing on, and it kind of just fixes your focus, and then you just feel like, yes, I've got this. I'm not really, and that doesn't kind of put it right, but I've kind of captured that, if you like. And also, I've added to the dialogue, which is very difficult to get dialogue among teachers. I'm not talking just within the staff room, but if you think even within your own country or your own region or internationally, the dialogue amongst teachers internationally, it's very difficult to find or be a part of that because it isn't out there to respond to in the same way that you get articles in journals and readers respond or whatever, or people are aware of what people are thinking, and I don't know, it just kind of catches it, I think, which makes it different to my own personal development. I've been thinking about this question all the time. What's the difference between my professional development as a teacher and research? I mean, where do you draw the line?
I would really agree with that, and what we were saying earlier. For me, in this experience, having the action research and having like the theme of trying to help the students improve their presentations, it's given my teaching my sort of commitment to teaching, a focus, and sort of a commitment. And also, when you're going to conferences or reading, it's like you've got your sort of antennae out and, oh, that could be an interesting thing to share with my students to see if they want to try out, to see if we can improve the presentations. So it gives a focus, a weight to what you hear and what you read in the sort of language world, the English language teaching world.
Prabhu had a very nice idea, I think, that if you visited a teacher in a classroom, you should expect to see teaching at sort of 3 different stages of development. Some of the things the teacher would be doing would be stuff the teacher is familiar with, happy with, and hasn't changed for a long time, because he's no reason to change. Some of it would be stuff that the teacher is worried about but can't imagine doing anything about yet. And some of it would be where the teacher is actively trying to find ways of getting it better. And that seems to be a reasonable way of looking at it, to say, you know, life is too complicated to be doing, researching everything all the time. But that you need to have the comfort of being able to do some things that you take for granted, but know you can't shouldn't, and look at one day. Other things where you know you really should take for granted, but you can't do everything. And then a few things where you really can explore and experiment and so on. But if the person is not in that phase in any of their work, then that's very sad, basically. There's another slogan I tried once. Good teaching is good research. And good research is good teaching. Not all research has to be good teaching, by any means. But good research in the classroom can be good teaching. And good teaching in the classroom is almost bound to be good research, in the sense that the people there are trying to understand what they're doing. And that's all it takes, really. Whether you call it research or not is an entirely different matter, and is huge bones of contention. When I first started working in Brazil, they had a newsletter in the school I was working at, which was called Research News. And I was led to believe that it frightened teachers. And they wouldn't put anything into the newsletter because they didn't think it would qualify as research. So I tried suggesting a different title, and for a year or so, it was called News and Views. And a few more people contributed. But then the teacher came back and said, what do you mean we're not doing research? Of course we're doing research. Change it back again. You know, don't be silly. It was a very interesting development. I don't know if you guys will remember it the same way. It's back in the early 90s. But it was, for me, it was very dramatic. The teachers responded by saying, we're doing research. We're looking at all these different things going on. How dare you, you know, not let us have that name on the work we do whenever we write a story about it in the newsletter.
I think adding to this, I don't know if it applies to every context, but I would very much, I do like the idea of the genre of, you know, teacher research finding its own genre or genres. I think poster presentations is a genre type of presentation, but also in the world of university-school relationships, there is this terrible hierarchical relation between what's university-oriented or based publication or research, etc., and what teachers, and I'm talking about, I don't know how it applies here, but to school teachers, for example. And if you present at an academic event something that is not traditionally understood as an academic paper, it will be, it even has a different name, like a report or an experience report, you know? So, and when you apply, for example, if a teacher wants to participate and share her understandings, which she thinks are very deep and so on, she has to, for example, can only submit her paper with a supervisor. Because it's like, if she does it on her own, you know, she's not probably doing it right or worthwhile listening to it. So I mean, so it's a genre, it's a type of context where presentations could be valued more and more.
See, I don't think we think of this as being insurgent enough. That's my point.
And I like your devil's advocate question, and I'd like to take it further and say the questions that I wrote down this morning are what counts as research?
Well, and who counts it?
And who gets to say what counts? And those to me are really important questions. And this whole question about, well, if I'm a teacher, if I'm an ordinary teacher, and I am trying to present something, somehow it's not quite as good as if I'm an academic presenting things. So that seems to me not quite right.
Whereas the ordinary teacher is the one who has more experience.
Exactly.
Sorry, academic.
Yeah. And I suppose
It's
it's
the
kind
teacher
of
that
halfway
has
between the two.
Yeah.
You have an identity crisis.
If you want to make educational change, a lot of decisions about education, which, all the changes come from above. People who are so far out of touch with the reality of what we are going through right now in the classroom, it gives us a voice, and we can be taken more seriously, because people don't take it as seriously as they should. So I'm a very strong believer that we should publish. And be taken more seriously, because it's taken out of our hands, and all these decisions are made which aren't necessarily the best ones for education. And we suffer because of it. And I think we have to stop thinking in terms of higher academic or more academic. And I think we have to completely stop thinking in terms of this kind of linear. We have to look at a kind of horizontal approach and this whole idea of new genres, and fit for purpose, and who's the readership, and who's going to benefit, and what are the aims of this kind of publication, whatever form it may take, and just remove, separate, if you like, away from that.
Yeah.
In response to your question, I would say in my part of the world, especially in my country, sometimes good teaching happens because you happen to have a good teacher and you've learned good practices unconsciously. But when you do research, when you take a note of what you have been doing or somebody else has been doing, you become conscious. That raises your awareness and your noticing skills, which could lead to some kind of sustainability of good practices and dumping down the bad one consciously on a conscious basis. And I think if you do research, and if you especially do it collaboratively, then you don't feel as isolated as you generally do as a teacher, where you have nothing to share with anyone and you don't get any kind of feedback. So that's, I think, is the difference between, for me, good teaching and research.
Lee Shulman, professor in the U.S., talks about research as being disciplined inquiry. And what he does with the word disciplined is, I think, very relevant to what we're talking about here. Because discipline has two meanings. One is the methodicalness that we saw in so many of these posters. I mean, to me, the example, Claire, you gave of, if they wanted feedback on this, that's what I gave them feedback on, even though there might have been a lot of other stuff I could have said something about. That's a form of discipline, that you're undertaking to understand a phenomenon. That's one meaning, but the other is discipline in the sense of a field of knowledge, like a discipline of biology or chemistry or history. And maybe what we're wrestling with here is we don't have a discipline of teaching. And that's why the genres, we haven't yet got the genres that we need. Let me just put out another thing that really worries me that's related to the genre question, which is another way that I think this notion of research is being co-opted away from teachers is in national reforms that now expect action research to be part of what teachers have to do. This is very prevalent in state systems. Singapore would be a key example, but there are many others where it's adopted as part of a career progression. And I guess my concern about that is that takes it away from the actual impetus to understand something and embeds it in the larger social system. And beyond that, and we were talking about this, some of us at dinner last night, it also sanitizes action research and turns it into problem solving, which it's not. I mean, action research, if you really do it, is about social issues and social problems. And I'm sure that reformers who want all their teachers to do action research probably don't want them questioning class size or who pays for the books or who decides what the curriculum is. They want them to solve problems within class. So I think maybe one of the takeaways for me of this day is how do we get control back?
One of the ways I thought we might be getting control back in about 1981, we by persuading T-Cell to accept posters as a form of presentation. And then for years and years, I keep on writing to people saying, okay, if you won't get funding because you're only doing a poster, just tell them you've got a presentation on the program.
Yeah.
And see if that works. And then T-Cell itself was hiding the posters right behind the books and so on. You know. All sorts of ways. I ran the IATEFL poster sessions for it. They say, where do you find them after the event? Either, there's wonderful poster sessions in my memory, but a long time ago, but they don't sort of count somehow in the reports, because they're not papers. People don't write up a poster as a paper unless they accept it as a paper independently. There's no vehicle for posters to get any sort of exposure after the event. And that's really weird, and it's a way in which I think, although since it's a long time since I've directly involved, people here need help me. It's the way the teacher associations have let us down, I think, by not making them. Some medical groups only accept posters, they don't have speeches. Andrew Wright, who was the main poster developer in this country, wonderful ideas about posters. He was invited to a medical convention because he was a visiting speaker. They said, you've got to give a talk. Everybody else had to give a poster. He wasn't allowed to because he was the distinguished visiting speaker who was going to talk about posters. It is amazing to me that we've not picked up on that and run with it in all sorts of ways. It diffuses the situation for the presenter. It gives you a chance in T-Cell at its best. You might have a whole room full of posters that are there all day. Sometimes they couldn't afford to keep the room open all day. You might get a room open all day, you could wander whenever you like. In IATEFL 2, you could put, if you presented a poster, you could put your name, perhaps even a telephone number, and when you were going to be at the poster if somebody wanted to talk to you about it. There's all sorts of inventive ways to lower the tension that people get from presenting a paper in a public domain. And I just can't understand why we missed that opportunity. I obviously didn't work hard enough for it, but it was very interesting to try to see what would happen if we had a poster session. But I really don't. I hoped it would take over the genre of language teaching conferences, but it manifestly hasn't.
I think that to go back to John's point about, you know, I see this more and more too, in national policies, suddenly seeing teacher development somehow being reinterpreted or redrawn as a necessity for teachers to be involved in doing action research. And I think that we somehow have to also try to resist that kind of movement towards assuming that all teachers at whatever stages of their career, I always get very worried when I see this happening to young and beginning teachers, maybe even in pre-training, pre-service type programs where there's a large element of research that has to be introduced. I'm not sure quite what the answer is, but I'm just raising this as something that I feel equally concerned of. I really dislike seeing action research just being put into large-scale policy development as if it's a sort of panacea for fixing up the difficulties that national governments may see around teacher quality or the quality of teaching. So I really think that we somehow have to resist that idea too. Just something that I think is not a good kind of development for action research. I think it goes back to that idea of action research as a sort of easy problem-solving version of action research, which again is not helpful.
Can I just ask you a question? As an EAP teacher, I understand the similarities between action research and exploratory practice, meaning that they both explore puzzles and teachers and students work together in collaboration in the classroom. But in your opinion, so Anne and Don, What do you think are the main differences between action research and exploratory practice?
That's ridiculous, Judith.
Yeah.
That's good. I think, let me just not respond, but preface. I think your addressing is a very good question, because one of the things that happens in the evolution of a professional discourse is we start using the same words about, and it all gets a little bit muddy, which ends up, because we don't sharpen, or we're a little averse to sharpening the distinctions because that implies a comparison, which it doesn't need to do. It just could imply a specificity that helps us think more clearly about what the instrumentalities of these different ways of probing what's going on are. But how would you say, what would you say the difference is?
I have my opinions, but
Yeah,
I'd like to hear
I do too, but let's let Dick go first. Yeah.
I don't think we've got enough days in the week. So it is very difficult to persuade people that we are just coming at it from the other end of the spectrum. You know, we are, people here are talking about action research, not about practitioner research, but that presumably is our life. And we are thinking of practitioner research as what, and thinking of the practitioners as being the learners and the teachers. And starting from that perspective, and then from experience where Inez in particular has developed these ideas in Korea, not in her university, for the university, so much as all over the place, with people coming to office, do things and running these annual events. I think I have a problem that, and it's, I don't know what on earth people think of it. I think it's going to sound, I don't know what it's going to sound like. I think action research has been catching up with exploratory practice for some years now. It has shifted from some of the early emphases. Do you remember some of the statements, Jean McNiff, I think? Identify a problem, imagine a solution. Not identify an issue you're interested in, see how on earth you can do to understand it in case you really didn't problem at all. But that was an appalling thing for me. And that's an awful long time ago, and I'm likely to be out of date if I think of that as a reasonable picture of what action research represents now. But I think what has happened, as we've heard today, is there's an awful lot more interest in the contribution of learners, an awful lot more interest in the contribution of learners to their own understanding, as well as helping teachers develop their understanding. So I am, in fact, on the other end of the spectrum, saying, although I think we start from a different end, although I think it is still possible to see sort of clear division between them if you want to, I don't really want to spend much time more of my life worrying about it. Life's too short to fuss over that, and it may be very arrogant of me to think it, but I do believe that action research has changed over the same 20 years or so that we've developed as well.
So one way of thinking about it might be, if you think about the color spectrum, action research is blue, and exploratory practice is cobalt blue, or turquoise blue. It's a form of blue, and then so in the sense there are commonalities that run through it, but the term is used in a more broad way, because what Dick's talking about in the context of action research in certain school systems in the US, it's the same. It's it's an orientation toward the practice of life in the classroom. So you look at Center X at UCLA, which does pretty radical student and teacher action research. They would be completely in agreement with the principles of exploratory practice. So they're cobalt blue. But then you have these large-scale policy statements of all teachers will do action research. That's like any kind of blue you want to call blue. You know, it's just very, very broad. And that's, I think, the problem. That's the co-opting. That's what I worry about is, you know, then it's like, well, you know, how many colors of blue do you actually want before you say, no, this is it, and that other stuff is not it.
The reason that I prefer the term action research is because for me it has the democratic possibilities that people who have traditionally been called teachers are also researchers. And the idea of action research, I think, is inclusive because, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, teachers are not just teachers, they're also researchers. So by using the term action research, that brings everybody into the fold, because I think there's been an unfortunate separation between the academic researcher in the ivory tower and the teacher who does the sort of other end of the stuff. And I don't think that that's a healthy situation. So the term for me is one of democratizing the whole field and saying we should have people doing research who can be academics if they want to be, they can be teachers if they want to be, they can be learners if they want to be. Why not make it an inclusive fold where everybody can become part of it and work together to know more and understand more about what goes on in educational situations. So that, for me, is the sort of guiding thing.
I worry a bit about saying the teacher is also a researcher, because some of the things we've been saying earlier, we wanted to say being a teacher is being a researcher. Good teachers are doing this research. Good teachers are all the time trying to find ways of understanding what's going on so they can improve the quality of their life and class supervising. And I think for us, this helped to reinforce the notion of practitioner research, because it has helped us insist on the notion of learners as practitioners of learning. People who have a right to try to learn how to be learners, as well as teachers who have a right to try and learn how to be teachers. I also have a line which may be difficult to work on, but I think teachers are also learners in all their situations, and learners are also teachers in their situation. They are doing all sorts of things that may be different to what other learners can get from the classroom. And I think if we can help people understand this sort of co-practitioner with two different roles, but overlapping in the sense that both have to have it